Here's a situation that I've experienced, and I'm wondering if you've experienced the same thing. This experience is one of entering into a situation or an environment where you don't have an abundance of wisdom. You don't really have expertise. What I'm trying to say is you don't know anything. You've gotten started on a home repair project that is above your skill level, or you've gone to the store to shop for a product with which you are unfamiliar, or you've found yourself in a conversation about something about which you know nothing. At first, you think to yourself in any of these situations, this is okay. I can handle this. I can fake it till I make it, right? You wander around the aisles of Lowe's trying to look like you know what you're doing, or you keep looking back and forth from the assembly instructions to the heap of metal that is supposed to be an office chair, or you keep blankly staring at your conversation partner, just hoping that they don't notice your ignorance. You nod along, you pretend to know what is happening. You ask no clarifying questions because you don't want to betray your ignorance. So this works for a while. You get away with it. You start to get confident. I got this. No one knows. I've pulled it off. Then everything collapses. You're asked a question that you can't answer, or some acronym is referenced that just sounds like alphabet soup, and you realize that the game is up. You've been found out. You have to confess your ignorance or just run away from the whole thing. This has happened to me a lot, especially when talking to people about cars. Now, don't get me wrong, I've been under my fair share of cars, and I can make my way through a conversation about cars, as long as it's about like brake pads or oil filters or washer fluid, the basic stuff, the entry-level stuff. But if someone starts talking about alternators or timing belts or drive shafts or carburetors or the rear drivetrain, I start to look for an escape route, because I realize that I'm in too deep and I don't actually know what any of those things means. Sometimes, admitting our ignorance is difficult. It can be a vulnerable experience to go into an encounter saying, I don't know something. What does this mean? Or I need you to teach me about this. That requires some vulnerability that can be uncomfortable. Many of us have memories of being picked on or being shamed for not knowing something. That can keep us from being willing to ask questions, revealing our ignorance. In the story from Mark today, there is a moment of glaring silence when it seems like the disciples are trying to roll with Jesus, not asking any questions, when questions seem like they'd be a pretty good idea. In the first part of this passage, Jesus predicts his death and resurrection for the second time in the Gospel of Mark. The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again. When I imagine myself in this story, listening on with the disciples, silence is not exactly my first instinct. I'm filled with questions, yet the disciples respond with silence. They don't understand what Jesus is saying, and they're too afraid to ask him. Perhaps their silence is not so foreign to us. Perhaps faking it describes us better than we'd like to admit. Perhaps we're grasping on to this faith thing, hoping that it won't become obvious how little we understand. We've gotten too far into it to start asking questions now. Or perhaps we're unwilling to ask questions because we're afraid of the answers. Asking questions means we might actually get answers, maybe even answers we don't like. And then we might have to heed the answers. We might be compelled into action if we seek understanding. There's another moment later on in this story when the disciples are given the floor to speak, but they remain conspicuously silent. In the middle of the story, after Jesus predicts his death and resurrection, Jesus and his disciples walk to Capernaum, and the disciples argue among themselves on the journey. It's typical back car seat, long road trip sibling banter. Dad loves me more. No, I'm mom's favorite. I'm the greatest. No, I'm the greatest. Pretty classic disciple stuff. When the group arrives in Capernaum, Jesus asks a very pointed question. What were you arguing about on the way? I imagine Jesus asks this question with a mock innocent tone. So, what have y'all been talking about? But Jesus knows what they were arguing about on the way. And the disciples know that Jesus knows what they were talking about. And Jesus knows that the disciples know that Jesus knows what they were talking about. The disciples are ashamed of their argument, and they stay quiet. They know that they were doing something that they really shouldn't have been doing. They know that arguing about who is the greatest is out of order. They know it, yet they do it anyway. They know Jesus is going to be disappointed. They know he will disapprove, but they do it anyway. Confronted about their pride, their desire for prestige, they can only stay silent in their guilt. Jesus has been talking about suffering and death. Jesus has been talking about sacrificing himself. Jesus has been talking about living with such openness, such acceptance and selflessness that he will be condemned and killed. And the disciples want to talk about their greatness and their glory. Jacob read for us from the letter of James, in which Jesus' ways are described as wisdom from on high, pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy. Yet the disciples are obsessed with earthly wisdom, envy, self-ambition, partiality, and hypocrisy. So often we are the same way. We like being of this world. We like honor and prestige. We like being recognized and celebrated, believing that our achievements are our own. We like winning. We give in to selfish ambition, envy, and partiality. These are the things of this world. These are the things about which the disciples argue. Yet Jesus models wisdom from above. If, instead of giving into fear and arguing about their greatness, the disciples do not remain silent, but ask Jesus some questions after his prediction, what kind of questions do you think they might have asked? What might have been Jesus' answers? What kind of questions might we ask given the same opportunity? Before we think about that, we had better be careful asking these questions, because we know many of their answers, and hearing the answers might force us to hear Jesus. Questions. Jesus, who betrays you? Who hands you over? Who kills you? We know the difficult answer. We do. It is Jesus' own disciples that betray him, his own people. It is the people that welcomed him into Jerusalem that call for his death. It is those who have power and privilege that execute him to keep the peace. Asking these questions makes us realize our own complacency, our own willingness to look away from those who suffer, our own desire to embrace and grasp onto our own power and our privilege to maintain the status quo. Questions. Jesus, what does it mean that you will rise from the dead? It's a pretty good one. We know the answer. It means that Christ will conquer death. It means that there is good news. The tomb cannot contain God's grace. It means that in life and in death, we belong to God. It means that our life is not our own, but a gift from God. And that we are called to live recognizing that gift, to live in gratitude and in service to God and to others. Questions. Jesus, why will this happen? Why will you be betrayed? Why will you be killed? We know the answer. Just by looking at the life of Jesus in the Gospels, we know the answer. Jesus spent time with outcasts and sinners. He called them brother and sister. He forgave sins and healed weaknesses. He spoke truth to power, and he protested the empire. He confronted apathy and complacency. He gave people food and drink, and he nourished their souls. He welcomed those who previously had no place to call home. Because of all of this, because his life and the way he lived was so threatening to those in power, Jesus was killed. Questions. Knowing all of this, Jesus, what should we do? This is perhaps the most terrifying question, because we know the answer to this one too, though we may prefer to avoid it. Knowing all of this, Jesus calls us to live as he lived. Jesus calls us to live a life of greatness, but not the kind of greatness about which the disciples quarrel. Jesus calls us to a life of greatness in service, a life like his. He says, whoever wants to be the first, whoever wants to be the greatest, must be the least of all and servant to all. And he places a small, vulnerable child in their midst and tells them to welcome one such as this. Jesus calls us to live a servant's life like his, to spend time with outcasts, sinners, to call them brother and sister, to forgive sins and to heal one another, to speak truth to power, to protest injustice, to set aside our apathy and our complacency, to give people food and drink, to nourish one another's souls, to welcome those who have no place to call home. This is what we are compelled to do, hearing the good news of Jesus Christ. Friends, consider the questions you are too afraid to ask. Consider the questions to which you know the answers, but are too afraid to heed. Perhaps you wonder, who is Jesus calling me to love? And you know exactly who Jesus will name. Perhaps you wonder, what is Jesus calling me to give up? And you know exactly what Jesus will call you to set aside. Perhaps you wonder, where is Jesus calling me to go? And what is Jesus calling me to do? And you know exactly where you need to go and exactly what you need to do. What is your question? Ask it and heed the answer. Amen.